It is with great pleasure that I received the invitation by the president of CIS to be part of this opening by sharing with you some experiences from our UNESCO International Institute for Higher Education in Latin America. As you have heard, our institute works mostly in the area of higher education and universities in that particular region in the world, but also having an important outreach activity as well. Now, let me say a few words about the challenges that the region is having when it comes to equity in higher education, and also share with you the examples of a number of countries that are struggling to make sure that the right to higher education becomes a reality. I'm using the term the right to higher education because that was precisely one of the most important conclusions of the very last World Higher Education Conference held in Barcelona last May. It was certainly the acknowledgement that the right to higher education is an integral part of the universal right to education. And as a proof of that, certainly we can recognize that a number of new governments in Latin America are really struggling to make sure that the right to higher education becomes more simply than a line in a policy discourse, but also has practical implications, particularly and not only related to funding. Let me mention the examples of Mexico, Peru, and more recently Chile and Colombia, as it was the case a few years ago with Brazil, where you can see certainly that governments are struggling to make sure that higher education becomes really an asset for also the most vulnerable populations. This has important implications in terms of funding, not only the funding of institutions, but more importantly, the funding of students. In those countries, as well as you can see in the United States, there is a huge issue when it comes to the student debt. And those new governments are already tackling, in a way, the issue in ways that can be, in many respects, innovative. But at the same time, they are also planning to expand the amount of public coverage of higher education serving their populations. And they are planning to do that in two different ways. One, by making sure that even in the most remote areas, access to higher education can really happen. In some cases, they plan to use intensively the learnings learned during the pandemic by way of expanding the use of technology. But certainly, in many cases, it's simply a matter of making sure that public institutions are also available in remote areas, particularly in rural locations. We have seen very good examples recently, for instance, in Mexico or in Peru. But at the same time, they're also making sure that the most vulnerable groups get access to higher education. And this is certainly a matter of funding, but also a matter of recognizing that equity in higher education begins, as a matter of fact, in preschool education. So in a way, higher education represents the very last stage of a continuum of inequities that happen in those societies. So please stay tuned, because our institute is planning to release a series of case studies in which we are going to document how these new governments are struggling to make sure that the right to higher education becomes a reality also in the region. That said, congratulations for having chosen this enormous, I would say, asset for all of us, which is equity in education. I couldn't think of any other theme more important at this time in our region, and wishing you all the success in this wonderful encounter that happens after the pandemic. Thank you very much, and looking forward to getting connected to you again.